The prince's breath was a ragged whistle against Kalen's spine. In the suffocating dark of the maintenance shaft, the hum of approaching blades vibrated through the floor. Kalen gripped a jagged piece of durasteel, his knuckles white. If they wanted the boy, they would have to go through a human who had forgotten how to be afraid. Have you ever felt the weight of a life that wasn't yours to carry, yet you couldn't imagine putting it down? Join us as we look into the moment a mundane man became a legend. 6 years before the tunnels became a tomb, the air on the zenith horizon had smelled of expensive ozone and recycled luxury. Kalen had been more concerned with a malfunctioning crate of nutrient paste than galactic diplomacy. Kalen Thorne was a man of margins. He lived in the footnotes of shipping manifests and the quiet hum of cargo bays, far from the polished marble of the Zenith's diplomatic suites. At the summit, he stood near a service pillar, hands tucked into his utilitarian jumpsuit, watching the Ethel Guardian delegation descend. They were statues of living obsidian and light, moving with a synchronized grace that made the human representatives look like uncoordinated toddlers. High Matriarch Zyla led them, her presence a physical pressure in the room, her eyes never once dropping to the logistics staff lining the walls. Beside her walked Prince Aurelius, a child of barely 7 cycles, his face a mask of royal indifference that seemed far too heavy for a boy so small. The air tasted like tension. Ethel Guardian physiology was built on more than just muscle and bone, for it was woven with resonance, a psychic frequency that dictated their entire social hierarchy. Their children did not simply grow, they underwent a selection, a moment where their internal frequency sought a secondary anchor to stabilize their developing psychic centers. Usually this was a high-ranking general or a priest. It was a form of soft power that ensured the ruling class was supported by the empire's most capable minds, creating a bond deeper than blood. It was the bedrock of their stability, a biological mandate that no one, not even a matriarch, could override. A sharp crack. The matriarch's voice sliced through the hall as she demanded the return of the Sunspire artifacts, her words carrying the threat of 1,000 warships. The human ambassadors stammered, their pleas for shared heritage falling on deaf ears. Kalen watched from his corner, feeling the itch of a man who knew he didn't belong in a room where worlds were being traded like tokens. Then the prince moved. Aurelius didn't walk toward the artifacts or the humans at the center of the room. He turned, his small boots clicking on the floor, and walked straight toward the service pillar. The matriarch froze. The room went silent. Before Kalen could even process the sudden focus of every dignitary in the sector, a small, cold hand gripped the fabric of his cargo pants. The boy didn't just touch him. He clung to Kalen's leg with a desperate, bone-deep intensity, burying his face in the rough fabric of the logistics tech's uniform. The eyes of an empire are heavy when they're all looking at you. Join us as we find out what happens when a human is chosen by destiny. Behind the royal guard, the matriarch's face shifted from cold stone to utter disbelief. Zyla approached, the air shimmering with her agitation. She looked at Kalen as if he were a particularly interesting piece of refuse that had somehow learned to stand upright. Her guards reached for the boy, but the prince let out a low, thrumming sound, a psychic shriek that made the glass fixtures in the ceiling vibrate. It was the sound of a soul rejecting its cage. Zyla held up a hand, stopping her soldiers. She explained the selection with a voice that sounded like grinding glass. Kalen Thorne, a man who couldn't even keep his apartment plants alive, had just been psychically claimed by the future of Ethelgard. The choice was presented not as an invitation, but as a necessity. Kalen could return to Earth, to his crates and his quiet life, and the prince would likely suffer a psychic collapse. Or Kalen could accept exile. He would live in the Luminaglass Palace, a human contamination in the heart of a xenophobic empire, to serve as the boy's secondary father. Kalen looked down at the child. Aurelius looked up, and for a second, Kalen didn't see a prince or an alien or a political disaster. He saw a scared kid who had found the only thing in the room that didn't feel like a weapon. During his first week in the crystalline silence of the palace, Kalen found a jagged piece of iridescent rock on his windowsill. It was unpolished and sharp, a fragment of the garden's outer wall. left there by a boy who didn't yet know how to say thank you. Kaelin stayed. The matriarch stood in the doorway of his small quarters, her shadow stretching across the floor. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice unusually soft. "You can still leave before the bond hardens." Kaelin didn't look up from the boy asleep on the floor. "He's not an artifact, Zyla. He's a son." The years of exile were not measured in solar cycles, but in the slow softening of Aurelius's rigid psychic shell. To the court, Kaelin was a primitive shadow haunting the royal halls, but to the prince, he was the only source of warmth in a civilization of cold light. While the Ethelgardian tutors drilled the boy on tactical dominance, Kaelin taught him how to listen to the silence between heartbeats. He used his logistics background to map the palace, not as a monument, but as a machine. He spent hours tracing the palace's hidden veins, the service tunnels and ventilation shafts that kept the massive structure breathing, memorizing the layout with the precision of a man who knew that one day, the exits would matter more than the entrances. The obsidian shard moved with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Their blades were forged from the same psychic resonance that powered the Empire, capable of cutting through steel as if it were air. They came to purge the alien influence, their voices a chorus of psychic static that paralyzed the royal guard. When the first explosions rocked the eastern spire, Kaelin didn't look for a weapon. He knew the palace's heart was a maze, and he was the only one who had walked every inch of its shadows. Family. And now, in the suffocating dark of the maintenance shaft, the whistle of the prince's breath was the only thing Kaelin could hear. The glowing blades of the assassins were closing in, exactly as he knew they would. Kaelin stood his ground. The jagged durasteel felt heavy, a primitive tool against a civilization of light, but he wasn't fighting with technology. He was fighting with the weight of every moment he had spent watching the boy grow. When the first assassin lunged, Kaelin didn't parry. He stepped into the strike, using the momentum to jam his lever into the vent's primary release valve. The structural integrity of the corridor had been compromised by the earlier blasts, and Kaelin knew exactly which bolt held the ceiling up. With a scream of straining metal, the corridor groaned and buckled. The world collapsed. A roar of shifting stone and glass filled the tunnel as the ceiling gave way, separating the prince from the killers. Kaelin didn't move to escape. He curled his body over Aurelius, acting as a shield against the falling debris. When the loyalist reinforcements finally cut through the rubble, they found a human covered in gray dust and blood, his hands still locked around the future emperor. In the wreckage of the palace, the matriarch found them. She looked at Kaelin, her eyes wide with a dawning realization that empathy was a force more durable than psychic might. She bowed, her royal forehead touching the dust of the floor. Years bled into decades. The elderly human stood on the balcony, his hand resting on the shoulder of the emperor. Aurelius held the iridescent rock high, showing the council the primitive fragment that had saved their lineage. He opened the borders that day, his voice steady and full of the humanity he had learned in the dark. The twin moons rose over a city of many colors. That small, jagged rock became the cornerstone of a galaxy without walls. Do you think the prince's first decree was a tribute to Kaelin's lessons or a necessity for his people? We'll see you for the next story.